The road stretched on, quiet and deserted except for the occasional bird darting across the sky. The rhythmic sound of the tires against the pavement began to lull David into a reflective state. He thought about the upcoming town hall meeting, where he'd face questions about the department's budget and his plans for improving community outreach. He thought about the new officers he'd hired, young men eager to prove themselves but still rough around the edges. And he thought about Sarah and Abby waiting for him at home, their unwavering support a constant source of strength. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden roar of an engine behind him. In his rearview mirror, David saw a car approaching rapidly, its headlights glaring in the fading light. The vehicle swerved dangerously, crossing into the opposite lane before jerking back into place. David's heart quickened as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. Whoever was behind the wheel was driving recklessly, putting themselves and others at risk. David eased his truck to the side, hoping the car would pass, but instead, the driver pulled up alongside him, matching his speed. Through the open window, David caught a glimpse of the occupants, 2 young men, their faces partially obscured by the shadows of the setting sun. One of them leaned out, shouting something David couldn't quite make out, before tossing an empty beer can that bounced off the hood of his truck. "Great," David muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. He flicked on his high beams, illuminating the car's rear as it swerved back into its lane and accelerated. For a moment, he considered letting it go. He wasn't in his patrol car, and he wasn't wearing his uniform. But his sense of duty wouldn't let him ignore the reckless behavior. This was his town, and it was his responsibility to keep its roads safe. David pressed his foot down on the gas pedal, closing the distance between his truck and the speeding car. The 2 men inside seemed to notice him following, their taillights flickering as they braked suddenly and turned onto a narrow side road that led to an old, abandoned gas station. David hesitated for a split second, his instincts warning him that this could be trouble. But he wasn't about to back down now. The road was rough, gravel crunching beneath his tires as he followed the car into the empty lot. The gas station loomed ahead, its windows shattered and its pumps long since rusted over. The car screeched to a halt, and the 2 men stumbled out, laughing loudly. David parked a safe distance away, turning off his engine as he grabbed his badge from the glove compartment. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the men. "Hey," he called, his voice firm but calm. "You boys need to slow down. You could have killed someone driving like that." The taller of the 2 men turned to face him, his laughter fading as his expression hardened. He was young, probably mid-20s, with a cocky swagger that made David's stomach churn. "What's it to you, old man?" The young man sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Why don't you mind your own business?" David stopped a few feet away, his badge held loosely in his hand. "I am minding my business," he said evenly. "I'm Sheriff Hayes, and I suggest you explain yourselves." The second man, shorter and stockier, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the MAGA hat still sitting on the passenger seat of David's truck. "Sheriff, huh?" he said, his tone mocking. "Doesn't look like any sheriff I've ever seen. You sure you're not just some wannabe?" David's patience was wearing thin. "I don't care what you think," he said, his voice steady. "What I care about is making sure you're not endangering anyone else on these roads." But his calm demeanor only seemed to provoke them further. The taller man took a step closer, his hands on his hips. "You think you're in charge here?" he said, his voice rising. "You think that badge makes you special?" Before David could respond, the second man pointed toward the hat. "What's that?" he said, his lips curling into a sneer. "You one of those MAGA guys?" David glanced toward his truck, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "That's got nothing to do with this," he said, his tone measured. But the shorter man wasn't listening. He strode toward the truck, snatching up the hat before David could stop him. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real patriot," he said mockingly, holding the hat up for his friend to see. "Put it down," David said, his voice sharp. "That's mine." The taller man laughed, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "You're awful bossy for someone who's not wearing a uniform," he said. "You sure you're the sheriff?" David took a step forward, his hand tightening around his badge. "I don't have to prove myself to you," he said. "Now put the hat back and get in your car before this gets any worse." But the men ignored him. The shorter one pulled a lighter from his pocket, flicking it open with a grin. "Let's see how much this hat means to you," he said. David's heart sank as he watched the flame catch the edge of the hat, the fabric curling and blackening. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Stop." But it was too late. The taller man grabbed a rag from the back seat of their car, stuffing it into the gas tank of David's truck before tossing the burning hat on top. For a moment, there was silence. Then the fire roared to life, flames engulfing the truck as black smoke billowed into the night sky. David could only stand frozen, his heart pounding as the men's laughter rang in his ears. "Next time, keep your opinions to yourself," the taller man said as they climbed into their car and sped away, leaving David alone with the blazing wreckage of his truck. The roaring flames illuminated the deserted lot, casting long, flickering shadows across the cracked pavement of the abandoned gas station. Sheriff David Hayes stood frozen for a moment, his breath caught in his throat as he watched his beloved truck, his companion through years of service, become an inferno of orange and black. The acrid stench of burning rubber and gasoline filled the air, stinging his nose and eyes. His MAGA hat, now engulfed in flames, sat atop the blaze like a cruel symbol of mockery, curling and blackening until it was unrecognizable. The young men's laughter echoed as their taillights disappeared down the dirt road, leaving David alone with the wreckage. His mind raced. How had this escalated so quickly? Just moments ago, he had been a tired sheriff heading home to his family. Now, he stood bruised, humiliated, and shaken, his truck reduced to nothing more than a smoldering husk. But as the initial shock faded, another feeling took its place: anger. Not the kind of blind rage that clouded judgment, but a deep, smoldering fury that came from betrayal. Those young men hadn't just disrespected him, they had violated the trust and integrity of the badge they supposedly served under. And to make matters worse, they had mocked him for his beliefs, his roots, and his humanity. David inhaled deeply, trying to steady his nerves despite the pain in his ribs from being shoved to the ground. His jaw tightened as he reached for his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he dialed the station. The line rang twice before Lieutenant Maria Torres picked up, her voice crisp and professional. "Sheriff," she said, a note of surprise in her tone. "What's going on?" "Maria," David began, his voice strained but steady. "I need you to send a unit out to the old gas station on Route 8, 2 officers rookies. I think just destroyed my truck." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. "Wait, what?" Maria finally managed, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Destroyed your truck? Sheriff, are you all right?" "I'm fine," David said, though his body ached with every breath. "They didn't recognize me. They thought I was just some random guy. But it doesn't matter who they thought I was. What they did is unacceptable. We need to find them before they do something worse." "I'm on it," Maria said firmly, the steel in her voice reassuring. "Stay where you are. I'll send someone to pick you up." David ended the call and leaned heavily against the rusted frame of an old gas pump, his legs trembling beneath him. The fire from his truck continued to crackle and roar, the heat radiating against his skin. He watched as the flames began to die down, leaving behind charred metal and ashes, a stark reminder of what had just happened. As he waited, David's mind drifted to another time, another place. Years ago, as a young deputy, he had faced a similar kind of humiliation. Back then, he had been pulled over by another officer while off duty, accused of stealing the very car he was driving, his own car. The officer hadn't recognized him, and when David had tried to explain, he'd been met with derision and suspicion. It had taken hours to clear his name, but the experience had left a scar. He had promised himself that if he ever rose to a position of power, he would create a department where such bias and arrogance had no place. He had worked tirelessly to build that culture in Cedar Wood, mentoring young officers, holding them accountable, and emphasizing the values of respect and service. But tonight, standing alone in the glow of the dying fire, he felt the sting of failure. Had his message not reached them? Or were these two simply beyond saving? The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. A patrol car came into view, its blue and red lights flashing in the darkness. Maria Torres stepped out, her sharp eyes scanning the scene before locking onto David. She approached quickly, her usual calm demeanor replaced by visible concern. "Sheriff," she said, her voice low but urgent. "What the hell happened here?" David straightened, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his side. "Two officers," he said simply. gesturing toward the smoldering remains of his truck. I followed them after they were driving recklessly, tried to stop them, and this is what they did. Maria's eyes widened as she took in the wreckage. You're telling me two of our own did this? David nodded grimly. I recognized their faces, but not their names. They're rookies, new hires. And they didn't recognize me without the uniform. Maria's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw tightening. I get a list of all recent hires and match them to your description. We'll find them, Sheriff. David placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. Thank you, Maria, he said quietly. But I'm going to need more than just their names. I want them brought in, tonight. As Maria made calls to dispatch and coordinated the search, David sat in the back of the patrol car, cradling his side and watching the dark countryside pass by through the window. His mind remained sharp despite the pain. He couldn't let this go and answered. These men hadn't just disrespected him, they had disrespected the badge, the department, and the community they were sworn to protect. Within the hour, leads began to come in. A call from a concerned resident had placed the rogue officers' car near the outskirts of town, heading toward a secluded service road that led into the woods. Maria relayed the information over the radio, her tone clipped and efficient as she organized the responding units. They're cornering themselves, she muttered to David as she drove. That road doesn't lead anywhere except an old hunting cabin. They'll have nowhere to go. Good, David said, his voice firm. Let's make sure they know they're not untouchable. When they reached the service road, the air was thick with tension. Two patrol cars were already parked at the entrance, their lights cutting through the darkness. The officers stood ready, their hands resting on their holsters as they awaited instructions. David stepped out of the car slowly, his body protesting with every movement. He motioned for the officers to follow as he led the way down the narrow dirt path. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. As they approached the cabin, the faint glow of a campfire came into view. The two men were sitting on overturned logs, their laughter carrying through the still night air. They seemed oblivious to the approaching team, their cocky demeanor unshaken. David stopped a few yards away, his hand raised to signal the others to hold back. Then, with deliberate steps, he moved into the light of the fire, his shadow stretching long behind him. The taller man looked up first, his face twisting into a sneer. Well, he said, standing. If it isn't the old man. David said nothing at first, his gaze steady and unflinching. The shorter man shifted nervously, his bravado faltering as he noticed the other officers emerging from the shadows. You two made a big mistake tonight, David said finally, his voice calm but laced with steel. You didn't just burn my truck. You burned the trust this community placed in you. The taller man laughed, though it sounded forced. Trust, he said mockingly, please. You're just some guy who got in our way. David stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. No, he said, I'm the sheriff. And you're done. The taller officer's forced laugh echoed in the clearing. But the weight of the moment was palpable. The glow of the campfire flickered on Sheriff David Hayes' bruised face as he stepped closer, his presence cutting through the arrogance like a blade. Behind him, the other officers emerged from the shadows, their hands resting cautiously on their holsters. The tension was thick, the air heavy with the unspoken truth that this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. David's ribs ached with every breath, but he stood tall, his eyes locked on the two men who had burned his truck, mocked his beliefs, and, above all, betrayed the badge they wore. The shorter officer shifted nervously, his gaze darting between David and the approaching officers. His bravado from earlier was gone, replaced by the growing realization of the trouble they were in. The taller officer, however, wasn't ready to back down. He sneered, stepping toward David with a swagger that belied his fear. So, what now? He asked, his voice dripping with contempt. You gonna arrest us? For what? Hurting your feelings. David didn't flinch. His voice was calm, measured, and laced with steel. For reckless driving, for destruction of property, for assaulting your sheriff, and for disgracing this badge. The taller man faltered, his smirk wavering for a moment before he caught himself. Sheriff, huh? He said, trying to muster his earlier bravado. You sure don't look the part. Without the uniform, you're just another guy in a truck. How were we supposed to know? That's the problem, David said, his voice rising slightly. You didn't know, and you didn't care. You didn't care who I was. You didn't care what I stood for. All you saw was someone you thought you could intimidate, someone you thought didn't matter. The shorter officer finally spoke, his voice shaky. Look, Sheriff, we didn't mean for it to go that far. It was just a joke, you know? A little fun. A joke. David repeated, his tone sharp. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. Burning my truck was a joke? Shoving me to the ground, mocking me, those were jokes? The shorter officer looked away, his shoulders slumping under David's intense gaze. We didn't know it was your truck, he mumbled. We didn't know you were. Me, David finished for him. You didn't know I was your sheriff. But that shouldn't have mattered. It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you're supposed to serve and protect. And tonight, you did the opposite. David turned his gaze back to the taller officer, who had crossed his arms in defiance, but was visibly less confident. Do you have anything to say for yourself? David asked, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. The man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his jaw tightening. Yeah, he said finally, I think you're blowing this out of proportion. We've all had bad nights. You're acting like we killed somebody. David's expression darkened. You think this is just a bad night? He said, his voice trembling with restrained fury. You burned the truck I've driven for over a decade. You burned my father's hat, something that meant more to me than you could ever understand. And worse than that, you humiliated me, not as a sheriff, but as a man. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as the weight of the betrayal pressed against his chest. But this isn't about me, he continued, his voice softer now. It's about the badge you wear. It's about what it stands for. And tonight, you tarnished it. The taller officer's smirk was gone now, replaced by a flicker of unease. He glanced at the shorter man, who was staring at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the campfire. David turned to Lieutenant Maria Torres, who stood at his side, her expression hard. Cuff them, he said firmly. The shorter officer looked up, his face pale. Wait, Sheriff, please, he stammered. We didn't mean for it to go this far. Just give us another chance. David's eyes softened, but only slightly. You had your chance, he said, when you swore an oath to serve this community with integrity. And tonight, you failed. Maria stepped forward, her movements brisk and professional as she placed handcuffs on the shorter officer. He didn't resist, his shoulders sagging in defeat. The taller officer, however, pulled back, his eyes flashing with anger. This is ridiculous, he shouted. You can't do this. We're cops, just like you. David's voice was calm but unyielding. No, he said, you're not like me. A badge doesn't make you a cop. Your actions do. And tonight, your actions prove that you don't deserve to wear it. The taller man froze, his defiance faltering as Maria stepped toward him with the cuffs. He looked at David one last time, his expression a mix of anger and fear, before allowing himself to be restrained. Back at the station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers whispered among themselves as the two rogue cops were led into the holding cells. David followed behind, his steps slow and deliberate, each one a reminder of the pain in his ribs and the weight of the night. When the cell doors closed with a final clang, David turned to face the gathered officers. His gaze swept over them, taking in their worried expressions, their questions unspoken but clear in their eyes. You're all wondering what happened, he began, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. You're wondering why two of our own are sitting in those cells right now. The room was silent, every officer hanging on his words. They betrayed us, David said simply. They betrayed the badge, this department, and the trust of the community we serve. They thought they were above accountability. They thought they could act without consequences. And they were wrong. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. Let tonight be a lesson for all of us, he continued. It doesn't matter who you are or what rank you hold. When you put on this badge, you represent more than yourself. You represent this town. You represent justice. And if you forget that, you don't belong here. The officers nodded slowly, their respect for David evident in their somber expressions. One of the younger deputies, a rookie fresh out of the academy, stepped forward hesitantly. Sheriff, she said, her voice trembling slightly. What happens next? David's expression softened. We move forward, he said. We rebuild the trust that was broken tonight, and we make sure this never happens again. As the officers dispersed, Maria approached David, her eyes filled with concern. You need to rest, Sheriff, she said. You've been through hell tonight. David nodded slowly, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade. You're right, he admitted. But I'm not done yet. Maria raised an eyebrow. What else could you possibly do? David glanced toward the holding cells, where the two men sat in silence, their heads bowed. I need to make sure they understand what they've done, he said quietly. Not just to me, but to this department. Maria placed a hand on his shoulder. They'll understand, she said, and they'll face the consequences. You've done enough for one night. David sighed, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. Maybe, he said softly, but I owe it to this department and to myself to see this through. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The pain in his body was a reminder of what he had endured. But his resolve remained unshaken. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something new. A chance to rebuild, to restore integrity, and to ensure that the badge he wore would never again be tarnished by betrayal. The sun began its slow ascent over Cedar Wood, painting the horizon with soft shades of pink and gold. Sheriff David Hayes stood outside the police station, the crisp morning air stinging his lungs. Despite the ache in his ribs and the lingering sting of humiliation, his focus remained sharp. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind. Like a broken reel, the reckless officers, the flames consuming his truck, and the searing betrayal etched into their laughter. David leaned against the railing of the station steps, his hand resting on the badge clipped to his belt. He had spent his career fighting for accountability, for fairness, for the kind of justice that transcended politics and personal biases. Yet here he was, confronting not just the actions of two rogue officers, but the deeper cracks in a system he had worked so hard to uphold. Inside the station, the tension was palpable. Officers moved with purpose, their voices hushed and their gazes flickering toward the holding cells. The two officers sat inside, their postures slumped, the arrogance of the previous night stripped away. The taller one leaned against the wall, his jaw tight, while the shorter man sat on the edge of the bench, his hands gripping his knees. Neither spoke, their silence a stark contrast to the chaos they had caused. David walked through the hallway, his steps deliberate despite the pain that radiated through his side. Lieutenant Maria Torres met him halfway, a clipboard in hand and concern etched across her face. Sheriff, she said softly, falling into step beside him. The men are in holding, as you ordered. Reports are coming in from the patrol units who tracked them down. They didn't resist, but they've been quiet. David nodded, his expression unreadable. Good. Quiet means they're starting to realize what they've done. Maria hesitated, her gaze flicking to his bruised face. You sure you're okay? You should have gone to the hospital last night. I'm fine, David replied, his voice firm but not unkind. Right now, my priority is making sure these men understand the gravity of their actions. Maria sighed but didn't argue. She had worked with David long enough to know that once he set his mind to something, there was no dissuading him. What's the plan? She asked as they reached the door to the holding area. David paused, his hand resting on the door handle. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before answering. We're going to have a conversation, not as sheriff and deputies, but as men. Then we'll decide what happens next. The door to the holding area swung open, and the two officers looked up sharply. Their expressions were a mix of fear, shame, and defiance. The taller one straightened, his gaze hardening as David stepped inside. The shorter man shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor. David stood in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch and settle over them like a heavy blanket. When he finally did, his voice was calm, measured, and deliberate. Do you understand why you're here? He asked, his gaze sweeping between the two men. The shorter officer swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he struggled to find his voice. He began, but the taller man cut him off. This is ridiculous, the taller officer said, his voice dripping with defiance. You're acting like we committed some kind of crime. It was a mistake, okay? We didn't know it was you. David's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. A mistake? He repeated, his tone cool. Is that what you think this was? The taller man hesitated, his confidence faltering under David's piercing gaze. Yeah, he muttered, looking away. We did mean for it to get out of hand. David took a step closer, his voice rising slightly. Burning my truck was a mistake? Mocking me, shoving me to the ground that was a mistake? Or was it a deliberate act of arrogance and disrespect? The shorter officer finally spoke, his voice trembling. "We thought you were just some guy," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the floor. "We didn't know you were the sheriff." David exhaled sharply, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "And if I wasn't the sheriff?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "If I was just another man driving home after a long day, would you still think this was a mistake?" Neither man answered, their silence speaking louder than any words could. David's chest tightened as he looked at them. Two men who had sworn the same oath he had, who had worn the same badge with the same promise to serve and protect. And yet, in one reckless night, they had betrayed everything that badge stood for. David leaned against the edge of the table, his gaze never leaving the two men. "Let me tell you something about this badge," he began, his voice steady. "It's not just a piece of metal. It's a promise to uphold the law, to protect the vulnerable, to act with integrity even when no one's watching." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Last night, you broke that promise. You abused your power. You disrespected the badge, the department, and this community. And for what? A laugh? A moment of superiority?" The taller officer shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. "We get it, all right?" he muttered. "You don't need to lecture us." David's eyes flashed with anger. "No," he said sharply. "You don't get it, not yet. Because if you did, you wouldn't be sitting here trying to justify your actions. You'd be apologizing." The shorter man looked up, his face pale. "We're sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We really are." David's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "Sorry isn't enough," he said. "Sorry doesn't undo the damage you've done. Sorry doesn't rebuild the trust you've broken." He straightened, his hands resting on his hips. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued. "You're both going to be held accountable for your actions. You're going to face disciplinary action. And you're going to make amends not just to me, but to this department and this community." The taller man bristled, his defiance returning. "You're ruining our careers over one mistake," he said, his voice rising. "Don't you think that's a little extreme?" David's gaze hardened. "No," he said coldly. "What's extreme is two officers thinking they're above the law. What's extreme is the arrogance and entitlement that led you to burn a man's truck and walk away laughing. And what's extreme is me standing here, explaining why your actions have consequences." The taller man looked away, his shoulders slumping as the weight of David's words sank in. The shorter man nodded slowly, tears glistening in his eyes. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said quietly. "Just tell us how to fix this." As the officers were led away, David remained in the holding area, leaning heavily against the table as exhaustion finally caught up with him. Maria entered a moment later, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You handled that well," she said, handing him a cup of coffee. "But you should really get checked out. You're not invincible, you know?" David chuckled softly, though it was tinged with weariness. "I'm starting to realize that," he said, taking a sip of the coffee. "But this wasn't just about me. It was about sending a message to them, to the department, to the town." Maria nodded, her respect for him evident. "And I think they got the message." David looked out the window, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the darkness. The night had been long and painful, but it had also been necessary. Justice wasn't always easy, and accountability often came at a cost. But as he stood there, battered but unbroken, David felt a quiet resolve settle over him. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something better. The morning sun poured through the windows of the Cedarwood police station, bathing the building in a warm, golden light. The hum of activity inside was muted, tense, as if the events of the night still clung to the air like a storm refusing to dissipate. Sheriff David Hayes sat in his office, the room quiet except for the faint scratch of his pen against paper as he filled out the final incident report. Every movement was deliberate, his ribs aching with each small shift. But his focus remained unbroken. The door creaked open, and Lieutenant Maria Torres stepped in, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Sheriff," she said softly, holding a folder of paperwork. "It's time." David looked up, his gaze steady but tired. He set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. "Are they ready?" he asked. Maria nodded. "The team's waiting in the briefing room, and the two officers are prepped for the hearing. Everyone's on edge." "Good," David said, his voice firm. "They should be. This isn't just about them. It's about the message we're sending to the entire department." Maria hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. "You don't have to do this alone, she said gently. "We're all behind you." David gave her a faint smile, appreciating the sentiment, but he shook his head. "I need to be the one to do this, Maria. It's my responsibility." With that, he stood, wincing slightly as a sharp pain shot through his ribs. He grabbed his badge from the desk, clipping it to his belt with a sense of finality. The weight of it felt heavier than usual, a reminder of the authority and the accountability it symbolized. The briefing room was packed. Every officer in the department gathered in tight rows. The air was thick with tension. Conversations hushed and fleeting as David entered the room. All eyes turned to him, their expressions a mix of respect, curiosity, and unease. At the front of the room, the two rogue officers sat at a table, their hands folded in front of them. They looked smaller now, stripped of their arrogance and bravado, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. David stepped to the front, his boots echoing on the tiled floor. He took a moment to look out at his team, his gaze sweeping across the room. These were the men and women he had sworn to lead, the people who had placed their trust in him to uphold the law and maintain order. Today, that trust would be tested. "Good morning," David began, his voice steady but commanding. The room fell silent. "I called this meeting because what happened last night cannot and will not be ignored." He turned to the two officers, his eyes narrowing. "Officers Clark and Mitchell," he said, addressing them by name for the first time. "You both took an oath to serve and protect. Last night, you broke that oath. You betrayed the badge, this department, and the trust of this community." Clark, the taller of the two, opened his mouth to speak, but David raised a hand to stop him. "This is not the time for excuses," he said firmly. "This is the time for accountability." He turned back to the room, his gaze sweeping over the officers. "Let me make one thing clear," he continued. "What happened last night wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a blatant abuse of power. And if we allow that to go unpunished, then we are no better than the people we are sworn to protect this community from." The officers shifted in their seats, the weight of David's words sinking in. Clark and Mitchell sat motionless, their heads bowed, their earlier defiance replaced by visible remorse. David straightened, his voice growing softer but no less powerful. "There's a lesson here for all of us," he said. "The badge we wear is not a shield to hide behind. It's a symbol of responsibility, of integrity, of service. And when we betray that, we don't just hurt ourselves, we hurt the people who depend on us." He turned back to Clark and Mitchell, his expression hard. "Effective immediately, you are both relieved of duty. You will face disciplinary action, including potential criminal charges for your actions last night. The choice to abuse your authority is one you will answer for in this department and in a court of law." Clark's shoulders slumped further, his face pale. Mitchell swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he nodded slowly. Neither man spoke, their silence a tacit acknowledgement of their guilt. David looked at them for a moment longer, then stepped back, addressing the rest of the room. "This isn't just about them," he said. "This is about us, about who we are as a department, as a team, as a community. We have a choice to make. Do we allow this to define us, or do we rise above it and rebuild the trust that has been broken?" The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of David's words hanging heavy in the air. Then, slowly, one officer stood, his expression resolute. "We rebuild," he said firmly. Another officer stood, then another, until the entire room was on its feet. David felt a swell of pride mixed with a deep, lingering sadness for the betrayal that had brought them to this point. He nodded, acknowledging their support. After the meeting, David stepped outside into the cool morning air, the sunlight warm on his face. The events of the past day had taken their toll, but he felt a sense of closure. The two officers would face justice, and the department would move forward, stronger and more unified than before. Maria joined him on the steps, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. "That was powerful, Sheriff," she said, handing him the cup. "I think you got through to them." David took a sip, the bitter warmth grounding him. "I hope so," he said quietly. "But the real work starts now." Maria nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "You've always said this job is about more than just enforcing the law," she said. "It's about setting an example. And today, you did that." David looked out over the town, the quiet streets beginning to stir with life. "We have to be better," he said softly. not just for ourselves, but for the people who trust us to protect them. He stood there for a long moment, the weight of his badge resting heavily against his chest. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. The events of the past night had shaken him to his core, but they had also reminded him why he had taken this oath in the first place. As the town came to life around him, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced betrayal, humiliation, and pain, but he had emerged stronger. This wasn't the end of his story, it was the beginning of something new.